sound you're about to hear existed only in the nightmares of those who survived. A shotgun blast, then another, then silence so absolute it swallowed the screams of an entire family. On New Year's Day 2006, while the rest of America nursed champagne hangovers and watched football, 7 people lay dead in a modest home in Richmond, Virginia. 4 of them were children. The youngest was 4 years old. I'm going to tell you this story, not because it's easy, not because it has a happy ending in the traditional sense, but because within this darkness, within this absolute devastation, there exists something that needs to be witnessed, something that demands we pay attention. The Tucker family didn't make national headlines for long. Their names faded from memory almost as quickly as the news cycle moved on. But I remember. And after the next few chapters, you will too. You'll remember Percy L. Tucker. You'll remember his wife, Mary. You'll remember their children and grandchildren. And you'll remember the monster who walked among them, who sat at their table, who called them family. Because here's what makes this case different from every other home invasion you've ever heard about. This wasn't random. This wasn't strangers breaking down a door. This was something far more sinister. The killer had a key. The killer knew where they slept. The killer had eaten Christmas dinner with them just 1 week before. If you think you know where this story is going, I promise you don't. And if you think you can predict the ending, think again. Because this case took investigators down a path so twisted, so unexpected, that even seasoned homicide detectives questioned everything they thought they knew about family, about loyalty, and about the darkness that can hide behind a familiar face. Before we go any further, I need you to do something. If you're watching this on your phone while scrolling through social media, stop, put the phone down, and really listen. Because the Tucker family deserves more than half your attention. They deserve witnesses. They deserve people who will carry their story forward. So if you're committed to hearing this through, hit that subscribe button right now. Share this with someone who understands that true crime isn't entertainment. It's testimony. It's bearing witness to lives that mattered. Now let me take you back to a time before the blood, before the yellow tape, before the mugshots and the courtroom testimony. Let me take you to the beginning. Percy L. Tucker Sr. was born in Richmond, Virginia in 1939. He came up during a time when a black man's opportunities were measured in inches, not miles. But Percy, that's what everyone called him, Percy had something that couldn't be measured. He had determination carved into his bones. He started working at 14, odd jobs at first, cutting grass, cleaning gutters, anything that would put a few dollars in his pocket. By the time he was 22, he'd saved enough to put a down payment on a small house. That house would become everything to him. It represented what was possible when a man refused to accept the limitations the world tried to place on him. Percy met Mary in 1962 at a church social. She was 19, wearing a yellow dress that Percy would later say made her look like sunshine walking through the door. He proposed 3 months later. She said yes before he finished the question. They built a life together in that house, on Belsius Lane. Not a glamorous life, not a wealthy life, but a good life, an honest life. Percy worked at the Reynolds Metals Company for 37 years. Mary raised their children while working part-time at a local elementary school cafeteria. They paid their taxes. They went to church every Sunday. They waved to their neighbors and kept their lawn immaculate. By 2005, the Tucker household had expanded to include multiple generations. Percy was 66 years old, but still strong, still sharp. Mary was 62 and suffering from health problems that kept her mostly homebound. Their adult son, Percy L. Jr., lived with them along with his longtime girlfriend Ruby Holt and Ruby's 3 children from a previous relationship. The house was crowded. Sometimes tensions ran high, but there was love in those walls. There was laughter. On summer evenings, Percy Sr. would sit on the front porch and watch his grandchildren play in the yard. And he'd think about his own childhood, about the dreams he'd had, about how most of them had come true in ways he never could have imagined. But there was one person in the Tucker orbit who saw that house differently, who looked at Percy Sr. not as a patriarch to be respected, but as an obstacle to be removed, who saw the modest savings Percy had accumulated over 4 decades of work, not as a testament to discipline and sacrifice, but as a prize waiting to be claimed. His name was Ricky Javon Gray, and in December 2005, he was watching, waiting, planning. Ricky Gray was 28 years old when he first entered the Tucker family's world. He was the nephew of Ruby Holt, the woman who lived in the Tucker home with Percy L. Jr. This made him, in the loose terminology of extended families, a relative, someone who belonged, someone who could walk through the door without raising suspicion. To understand what Ricky Gray was capable of, you need to understand where he came from. But be careful here, because understanding is not excusing, explanation is not justification. There is nothing in Ricky Gray's past that makes what he did acceptable, nothing that earns him simpration. But there are factors that, when examined closely, help us understand how a human being can transform into something monstrous. Ricky grew up in Philadelphia in circumstances that could generously be described as difficult. His mother was in and out of his life. His father was mostly absent. He bounced between relatives, never staying anywhere long enough to form real attachments. By the time he was 16, he'd already had his first serious encounter with the law. But Ricky was smart, dangerously smart. He had a way of reading people, of understanding their weaknesses, of presenting exactly the version of himself that each situation required. When he needed to be charming, he was magnetic. When he needed to be threatening, he was terrifying. He could switch between these personas as easily as changing clothes. In 2005, Ricky Gray was living in the Richmond area with his wife, an 8-year-old daughter, and a mounting pile of problems. He'd accumulated debt. He'd burned bridges. He was running out of options. And somewhere in the tangled pathways of his mind, a plan began to form. It started with the Tuckers, family, people who trusted him, people who would let him in. I need to pause here and ask you something, and I want you to really think about this before you answer. How well do you really know the people you call family? The ones who sit at your holiday table? The ones you open your door for without a second thought? We assume blood means safety. We assume familiarity means we're protected. But how often do we really look? I mean really look at the people closest to us? Leave a comment below and tell me, has anyone in your family ever given you a feeling you couldn't explain? A moment of unease that you dismissed because acknowledging it felt disloyal? Christmas 2005 was the last normal holiday the Tucker family would ever have. Ricky Gray was there. He sat at their table. He ate Mary Tucker's cooking. He smiled at the children. He shook Percy Sr.'s hand. And the whole time he was taking mental notes. Where did Percy keep his money? What was the family's routine? Who slept where? When was the house most vulnerable? New Year's Eve came and went. The Tuckers stayed home, as they usually did. Percy Sr. didn't care much for parties. He preferred quiet evenings, maybe a glass of wine, watching the ball drop on television with Mary by his side. They had no way of knowing that 48 hours later, their home would be a crime scene. The detectives would walk through their living room, stepping over the bodies of people they loved. That their names would be reduced to statistics, to case numbers, to evidence tags. The clock was ticking, and Ricky Gray was ready. January 1st, 2006, a Sunday. The air outside was cold, that particular kind of Virginia winter cold that seeps through walls and settles in your bones. Inside the Tucker home, the heat was running. The lights were on, and 7 people were going about the ordinary business of living. Let me introduce you to each of them, because they deserve to be more than victims. They deserve to be remembered as people. Percy L. Tucker Sr., 66, the family patriarch. A man who'd worked his entire life for everything he had. His hands were calloused from decades of honest labor. His back ached from years of standing on factory floors, but his spirit was unbroken. He still woke up every morning at 5:30, a habit from his working days that he never could shake. Mary Tucker, 62, Percy's wife of 43 years. She suffered from diabetes and high blood pressure, conditions that kept her close to home. But her mind was sharp, and her faith was unwavering. She read her Bible every morning and prayed every night. She believed in goodness. She believed in family. She believed that God had a plan for everything. Percy L. Tucker Jr., 39, the couple's son. He'd had his struggles over the years. Who hasn't? But he was trying. He was living with his parents, helping out where he could, trying to build something with Ruby Holt, 34, Percy Jr.'s girlfriend. A woman who'd seen hard times and was looking for stability. She'd brought her 3 children into the Tucker home, hoping to give them a better life. She worked when she could, helped Mary around the house when she couldn't. She was grateful for the roof over her head. And then there were the children, Ruby's children. 3 of them, all under the age of 18. The youngest was only 4 years old. I'm going to stop here for a moment because I need you to understand something about what happened to these children. I'm not going to describe it in graphic detail. I refuse to turn their suffering into spectacle. But I need you to know that they existed. They had names. They had favorite foods and favorite cartoons, and things they were afraid of, and things that made them laugh. They were innocent in every possible sense of the word. And they were in that house when Ricky Gray came through the door. The exact timeline of what happened that night has been reconstructed from physical evidence, witness statements, and ultimately Ricky Gray's own confession. Here's what we know. Ricky Gray did not act alone. His accomplice was his nephew, Ray Joseph Dandridge, who was 18 years old at the time. Ray was also connected to the Tucker family through Ruby Holt. He was her son from a previous relationship, which meant he had grown up around these people. He knew them. They trusted him. The 2 men arrived at the Tucker home sometime in the early evening hours of January 1st. They didn't break in. They didn't have to. They were family. The door opened for them. What happened inside that house over the next several hours is difficult to describe and even more difficult to understand. The attack was not quick. It was not merciful. Ricky Gray, who would later be identified as the primary actor in the violence, took his time. He bound the family members. He tortured them. He demanded money, yes, but the brutality he inflicted went far beyond what any robbery could justify. Percy Sr. was beaten with a claw hammer. Mary Tucker, bedridden and defenseless, was shown no mercy. Percy Jr. and Ruby fought back with everything they had, but they were overwhelmed. And the children witnessed it, some of them, before they too became victims. I need to step back from the details now, not because they're not important, but because dwelling on them serves no purpose except to traumatize. What matters is this. By the time Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge left the Tucker home in the early morning hours of January the 2nd, 7 people were dead. An entire family wiped out. The killers took approximately $400 in cash, less than $60 per life. They also took Percy L. Tucker Jr.'s car, a green Toyota Camry, and they left behind a house full of bodies and evidence that would eventually lead investigators straight to them. But here's the thing about Ricky Gray. He wasn't done. See, what happened to the Tucker family wasn't the beginning of Ricky Gray's murder spree. It wasn't even the middle. The Tucker family murders were actually the second mass killing Ricky Gray committed in a 4-day period. I told you this story had a twist. Here it is. 4 days before the Tucker family was murdered, on December the 31st, 2005, Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge had entered another Richmond home. This one belonged to the Harvey family in a more affluent neighborhood across town. Brian Harvey was a successful musician, a member of the indie rock band House of Freaks. His wife Catherine was a toy designer. They had 2 daughters, Stella, 9, and Ruby, 4. The Harveys had no connection to Ricky Gray, none whatsoever. They were chosen randomly, selected because their house looked like it might contain things worth stealing. Brian Harvey had the misfortune of opening his door to 2 men who claimed their car had broken down nearby. What happened inside the Harvey home followed almost the exact same pattern as what would happen to the Tuckers days later. The family was bound. They were tortured. Brian and Catherine were killed. And the children. The Harvey family was discovered on January 1st, 2006, the same day the Tucker family was still alive, the same day Ricky Gray was finalizing his plans for his second massacre. When Richmond homicide detectives arrived at the Harvey crime scene, they were devastated. This kind of violence was rare in their city, a family of 4 wiped out in their own home. It made no sense. There was no apparent motive. Nothing valuable seemed to be missing. The killings appeared almost recreational. The Harvey case was all over the news. Every detective in the department was working overtime. Tips were flooding in. The pressure was immense. And while all of this was happening, while the entire city was focused on the Harvey murders, Ricky Gray was executing his second attack just a few miles away. It would take investigators several days to connect the 2 cases. The Tucker family wasn't discovered until January 3rd, when a family member went to check on them after repeated phone calls went unanswered. When police arrived at the Belsius Lane address and entered the home, hardened veterans broke down in tears. 2 families, 11 people, 4 of them children, all dead within a 4-day window, all at the hands of the same 2 men. The media called it the Richmond New Year's Massacre, the worst crime spree in Virginia history, a stain on the city that would take decades to fade. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because before justice could be served, the killers had to be caught. And while Ricky Gray wasn't particularly sophisticated in his methods, catching him wasn't going to be straightforward. Remember the car? Percy Tucker Jr.'s green Toyota Camry? That car would become crucial to cracking the case. But first, it would be driven all the way to Philadelphia, where Ricky Gray had friends and family, where he thought he could disappear. He was wrong, dead wrong. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Within days, detectives had connected the Tucker murders to the Harvey murders through forensic evidence. The same shoe prints appeared at both scenes. The same binding materials were used. The same excessive violence. The same signatures. They also had witnesses who reported seeing the green Camry in the Tucker neighborhood before the murders. They had family members who pointed fingers at Ricky Gray almost immediately. They had Ruby Holt's relatives, people who knew Ricky's capabilities, people who had been afraid of him for years. The net was closing. Ricky Gray just didn't know it yet. The scene that greeted Richmond police on January 3rd, 2006, would haunt every officer who walked through that door for the rest of their careers. I've spoken with investigators who worked this case, and even years later, they struggled to describe what they saw without their voices breaking. 7 bodies, multiple rooms, evidence of prolonged suffering. This wasn't a crime scene. It was a chamber of horrors. Detective Sergeant James Henderson was one of the first homicide investigators to arrive at the Tucker residence. In his 23 years on the force, he'd seen his share of violence. Richmond wasn't a peaceful city, but nothing had prepared him for Belsius Lane. You try to maintain professionalism, Henderson would later testify. You try to focus on the job, collecting evidence, documenting the scene. But when you see children, his voice failed him on the witness stand. He had to take a moment before continuing. When you see children, everything changes. The Tucker home was meticulously documented. Every inch was photographed. Every surface was dusted for fingerprints. Every drop of blood was sampled and cataloged. The medical examiner's team worked for hours, carefully removing each victim while preserving any evidence that might cling to them. What investigators found told a story of methodical cruelty. The victims had been bound with duct tape and electrical cords. They'd been positioned in specific ways. The weapon, a claw hammer, had been left behind, discarded carelessly in one of the rooms. Either the killers were supremely confident they wouldn't be caught, or they simply didn't care. The financial motive became apparent almost immediately. Percy L. Tucker Sr.'s wallet was missing. Several drawers had been ransacked, but the take was pathetically small. The Tuckers weren't wealthy people. They didn't keep large amounts of cash on hand. Whatever money Ricky Gray had expected to find, he was surely disappointed. But the murders weren't really about money. Not entirely. There was rage in this crime. Personal rage. The violence inflicted on the victims went far beyond what would be necessary to simply rob them. Someone had wanted these people to suffer. Someone had enjoyed making them suffer. This psychological profile was critical. Because while the Harvey murders, still being investigated simultaneously by a separate team, appeared random, the Tucker murders had all the hallmarks of personal knowledge. The killers knew this house. They knew these people. They hadn't broken in through a window or forced a door. They'd walked in like they belonged. Detective Henderson and his team began compiling a list of everyone connected to the Tucker household, family members, friends, acquaintances. anyone who might have had access, anyone who might have had a motive. Two names rose to the top almost immediately: Ricky Javon Gray and Ray Joseph Dandridge. Multiple family members reported that Ricky Gray had been acting erratically in the weeks leading up to the murders. He'd been asking strange questions about Percy Sr.'s finances. He'd been showing unusual interest in the family's daily routines. One relative recalled Ricky making a comment about how Percy had money hidden somewhere that he didn't share with anyone. More importantly, Ruby Holt's surviving family members, relatives who weren't in the Tucker home that night, confirmed that both Ricky and Ray had been seen in the area in the days before New Year's. But suspicion isn't proof. Henderson needed evidence. And that evidence was about to emerge in the most unexpected way. While the Tucker investigation was proceeding, the Harvey case team had made a breakthrough of their own. A witness had come forward claiming to have seen two men fleeing the Harvey neighborhood in a white van. The description was vague, but it was something. Then another witness emerged. This one had seen a green sedan, possibly a Toyota, parked near the Tucker residence on January 1st. The witness hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Cars came and went in the neighborhood all the time. But after seeing the news coverage, they contacted police. A green Toyota. Percy L. Tucker Jr. had owned a green Toyota Camry, and that car was now missing. Henderson put out a bulletin. The Camry's license plate was flagged nationwide. Every patrol officer in Virginia was looking for it. And then, almost miraculously, the car turned up. In Philadelphia. Pennsylvania State Police found the Camry abandoned on January 5th, 2006. It had been parked in a lot in northeast Philadelphia, just miles from where Ricky Gray had grown up. The interior contained blood evidence that would later be matched to multiple Tucker family victims. The net was closing. But Ricky Gray wasn't sitting still. He was moving, using whatever connections he had left to stay one step ahead of the law. He knew they were coming. He'd seen the news coverage. He knew it was only a matter of time. Meanwhile, back in Richmond, investigators made another crucial connection. The forensic evidence from the Tucker scene was compared to evidence from the Harvey scene. The results were staggering. Same shoe prints, same type of binding materials, same excessive violence, same pattern of family annihilation. 2 crime scenes, 1 killer. This realization changed everything. The Richmond Police Department consolidated the investigations. Resources were pooled. The pressure from media and public intensified exponentially. Now it wasn't just one terrible crime. It was a serial killing. A spree that had claimed 11 innocent lives in less than a week. The FBI was brought in to assist. Behavioral analysts began constructing a profile of the killer. What they concluded was disturbing but not surprising. This was someone who knew at least one of the victim families personally. Someone with a history of violence. Someone who had likely been escalating for years, building toward this explosion of homicidal rage. Ricky Gray fit the profile perfectly. On January 7th, 2006, less than a week after the Tucker murders, authorities located Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge in Philadelphia. They had been hiding in an apartment belonging to one of Ricky's associates. When police surrounded the building, both men surrendered without resistance. And the interrogations that followed would prove crucial to understanding what had happened and why. Ricky Gray was calm during his questioning, almost disturbingly calm. He didn't ask for a lawyer immediately, which was his right. Instead, he talked. He talked about his childhood. He talked about his grievances. He talked about how he felt the world had treated him unfairly. And then slowly, methodically, he began to confess. The Harvey family, he admitted. He and Ray had targeted them because their house looked wealthy. They'd posed as stranded motorists, and Brian Harvey had made the fatal mistake of opening his door to help them. Once inside, Ricky said, things had gotten out of control. That phrase, gotten out of control, would come up repeatedly in Gray's statements, as if the murders were accidents, as if he were merely a passenger in his own violence, unable to stop what was happening. But the evidence told a different story. The bindings, the torture, the deliberate killing of children. None of this was out of control. It was methodical. It was planned. It was enjoyed. When the interrogators turned to the Tucker family, Ricky's demeanor shifted slightly. There was something personal here, something that went beyond robbery. He admitted that he knew the Tuckers through his aunt, Ruby Holt. He admitted that he'd been to their home before. He admitted that he'd eaten meals with them, shared holidays with them, looked Percy L. Tucker Sr. in the eye, and shaken his hand. And then he'd gone back with a hammer and killed them all. Why? This is the question that haunted investigators, that haunts anyone who studies this case. Why would someone kill people who had shown them nothing but hospitality? People who'd welcomed him into their home as family? Ricky Gray's answer was chilling in its simplicity. They had money. I needed money. That's it. That was his justification for ending 7 lives, for orphaning children, for destroying an entire family tree. $400. That's what Percy L. Tucker Sr.'s lifetime of savings was reduced to in Ricky Gray's eyes. $400 and a green Toyota Camry. But if you think that's the whole story, you're wrong. Because beneath Ricky Gray's callous explanation lies a deeper truth about the nature of evil, about how it grows, about how it feeds on resentment and entitlement until it becomes capable of anything. We'll explore that truth in the chapters ahead. But first, let me ask you something. To understand how Ricky Javon Gray became capable of slaughtering 11 people in 4 days, we need to go backward. We need to trace the path that led him to those houses, those families, those moments of irreversible violence. This is not about sympathy. Let me be absolutely clear on that point. Nothing in Ricky Gray's past justifies what he did. Nothing excuses the choice he made to end innocent lives. But if we're going to make any sense of this tragedy, if we're going to learn anything from it, we need to understand how monsters are made. Ricky Gray was born in Philadelphia in 1977. His mother, by all accounts, struggled with addiction. His father was largely absent. He was raised, if you can call it that, in a succession of apartments and relatives' homes, never staying anywhere long enough to feel like he belonged. The first documented instance of Ricky's violent tendencies came when he was 8 years old. A neighbor reported that he had killed a stray cat by striking it repeatedly with a rock. When confronted, young Ricky showed no remorse. He simply shrugged and walked away. Animal cruelty in childhood is one of the most reliable predictors of later violence toward humans. It's part of what psychologists call the homicidal triad, a cluster of behaviors that includes animal cruelty, fire setting, and prolonged bedwetting. Ricky Gray exhibited at least 2 of these 3 warning signs before he reached adolescence, but no one intervened. No one got him help. He was just another troubled kid in a city full of troubled kids, falling through the cracks of a system that was too overwhelmed to catch him. By his teenage years, Ricky was committing petty crimes, theft, vandalism, minor assaults. He was in and out of juvenile detention facilities, places that should have rehabilitated him, but instead seemed to harden him further. He learned in those institutions that violence was power, that the strong took from the weak, that empathy was a liability. He was 17 when he committed his first serious assault. A dispute over drug territory led to Ricky beating another teenager so severely that the victim required reconstructive surgery. Ricky was tried as an adult and served 3 years in prison. Prison for someone with Ricky's psychological profile was essentially graduate school for violence. He emerged at 20 years old with new connections, new techniques, and a complete absence of regard for human life. And the next decade was a blur of criminal activity. Ricky drifted between Philadelphia and other East Coast cities, always staying ahead of serious charges, always managing to avoid the kind of lengthy sentence that might have kept him off the streets. He got married. He fathered a daughter. From the outside, it might have looked like he was settling down, becoming stable. But those who knew him well, really knew him, saw something different. They saw the rage that simmered constantly just below the surface. They saw the way his eyes changed when he was angry. They saw the casual cruelty he inflicted on anyone who crossed him. His wife later told investigators that she was terrified of him, that he had beaten her repeatedly, that he had threatened to kill her and their daughter if she ever tried to leave. She stayed because she believed he would make good on those threats. She stayed because she had seen what he was capable of. By 2005, Ricky Gray's life was unraveling. His criminal enterprises were failing. His debts were mounting. He had burned every bridge, exhausted every connection. He was desperate, and desperation in someone with his capacity for violence is a dangerous combination. That's when he started thinking about the Tuckers. Ricky knew about Percy L. Tucker Sr.'s savings because family members had mentioned it. Nothing specific, just casual comments about how Percy had worked his whole life, how he was careful with money, how he probably had a nice nest egg tucked away somewhere. To most people, these would have been innocuous observations. To Ricky Gray, they were an opportunity. He began planning. Not meticulously. Ricky was never a sophisticated criminal, but deliberately. He would hit the Tucker house. He would take whatever they had, and he would leave no witnesses. This last part was crucial to Ricky's thinking. He understood that he was known to the Tuckers, that they could identify him, that leaving any of them alive would mean leaving behind evidence that would lead directly to him. So from the very beginning, before he even entered that house, he had decided that everyone inside would have to die, including the children. How does a human being make such a decision? How does someone look at a 4-year-old child and see not innocence, not vulnerability, not a life full of potential, but simply an obstacle to be removed? This is where psychology reaches its limits. We can map the trajectory of Ricky Gray's life. We can identify the factors that contributed to his development into a violent offender. We can understand intellectually how years of abuse and neglect and institutional failure can warp a human soul. But there comes a point where understanding fails, where we have to simply acknowledge that some people choose evil. that they look at the fork in the road, the path toward destruction and the path toward redemption, and they deliberately choose destruction. Not because they have to, not because they have no other option, but because they want to. Ricky Gray wanted to hurt people. He derived satisfaction from their fear, their pain, their final moments. The Tucker family wasn't just a target. They were an indulgence, a feast of cruelty that he had been hungry for his entire life. And the Harvey family, they were practice, a warm-up, a way of testing whether he could really go through with what he'd been fantasizing about for years. Ray Dandridge, Ricky's nephew and accomplice, presents a different psychological profile. Ray was younger, only 18 at the time of the murders. He had been drawn into Ricky's orbit through family connections and a misguided sense of loyalty. But don't mistake Ray for an innocent victim of manipulation. He was present at both crime scenes. He participated in the bindings, the torture, the killings. He had opportunities to stop what was happening, to call for help, to walk away. He chose not to. In interrogations, Ray would try to minimize his role. He claimed that Ricky had forced him to participate, that he was afraid of what Ricky would do to him if he refused, that he had been a reluctant accomplice at best. And the evidence contradicted this narrative. Witnesses who encountered Ray and Ricky before the murders described them as partners, equals. Ray was not being coerced. He was collaborating. He may not have been the primary instigator, but he was a willing participant in 11 murders. This distinction matters for legal reasons, but on a moral level, it's almost irrelevant. Whether you're holding the hammer or just holding the victim down, you're responsible. Whether you strike the fatal blow or simply stand by and watch, the blood is on your hands. Ray Dandridge chose his path just as surely as Ricky Gray chose his. And both of them would face the consequences of that choice. By mid-January 2006, the case against Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge was building rapidly. The confessions were central, but prosecutors knew they needed more. Confessions can be recanted, lawyers can argue coercion, juries can have doubts. The physical evidence would prove insurmountable. At the Tucker crime scene, investigators had recovered the claw hammer used in the killings. It was covered in blood. Blood that DNA analysis would match to multiple victims. Fingerprints on the hammer's handle belonged to Ricky Gray. The duct tape used to bind the victims yielded additional fingerprints. The electrical cords showed traces of DNA from both Gray and Dandridge. The shoe prints tracked throughout the house matched shoes recovered from both men upon their arrest. Then there was the green Toyota Camry. The car that Percy L. Tucker Jr. had owned was found in Philadelphia with both men's fingerprints inside. Blood evidence in the trunk matched Tucker family victims. The car was a mobile crime scene, tying the perpetrators to the victims in a way that no defense attorney could explain away. The Harvey crime scene provided similar evidence, different location, different victims, but the same killers. The forensic links between the two crimes were overwhelming. Prosecutor Robert Trono was assigned to lead the state's case against Ricky Gray. Trono was a veteran of the Richmond Commonwealth's Attorney's Office, known for his meticulous preparation and his commitment to victims' families. In this case, that commitment would be tested, because the Tucker family, being black and working class, initially received less media attention than the Harvey family, who were white and middle class. This disparity troubled Trono and many others involved in the case. Every victim deserves equal justice, Trono would later say. Percy L. Tucker Sr. worked his entire life for what he had. Mary Tucker was a woman of faith who never hurt anyone. Those children, Ruby Holt's children, they deserved to grow up. They deserved futures. Their lives matter just as much as anyone else's. This statement reflected a broader truth about the American justice system's treatment of crime victims. Studies consistently show that crimes against white, affluent victims receive more media coverage and more aggressive prosecution than crimes against poor victims or victims of color. The Tucker family murders were at risk of being overshadowed by the Harvey murders, despite being equally horrific. To his credit, Trono refused to let that happen. He insisted that both cases be given equal weight, equal resources, equal attention. The Tucker family would not be forgotten. The grand jury indictments came down in February 2006. Ricky Gray was charged with 7 counts of capital murder for the Tucker family killings and 4 counts for the Harvey family killings. Ray Dandridge faced identical charges. Capital murder in Virginia carried 2 possible penalties: life in prison without the possibility of parole or death. The prosecution made clear from the beginning that they would seek the ultimate penalty for both defendants. Given the nature of the crimes, the torture, the murders of children, the complete absence of remorse, anything less seemed inadequate. The defense teams faced an almost impossible task. The evidence was overwhelming. The confessions were detailed and corroborated by physical proof. Their clients had admitted, in explicit terms, to killing 11 people, including 4 children. What possible defense could there be? For Ray Dandridge, the strategy was diminished capacity. His lawyers argued that he was under the psychological control of his uncle, that he lacked the maturity and independence to resist Ricky's influence, that he was essentially a victim of manipulation. For Ricky Gray, the defense was more complex. His attorneys couldn't deny his involvement. The evidence made that impossible. Instead, they focused on his mental state. They brought in psychological experts who testified about his traumatic childhood, his untreated mental illness, his history of abuse. The argument wasn't that Ricky Gray was innocent. The argument was that he was broken, that society had failed him at every turn, that the monster in the courtroom was, in some sense, society's creation. This defense would prove deeply divisive. On one hand, it raised legitimate questions about our collective responsibility for the people we fail as children. On the other hand, it seemed to deflect blame from the actual perpetrator onto abstract forces beyond anyone's control. The surviving members of the Tucker family, relatives who had lost parents, siblings, nieces, nephews, rejected this narrative completely. "Don't tell me about his childhood," one family member said outside the courthouse. "My Uncle Percy had a hard childhood too. He didn't kill anyone. He worked. He built a life. He raised a family. Ricky Gray made a choice. He chose to be evil." This sentiment would echo throughout the trial. Whatever explanation psychology could offer, whatever mitigating factors the defense could raise, they could not erase the fundamental reality. Ricky Gray had decided to murder 11 people, and he had carried out that decision with deliberate cruelty. The trial was scheduled to begin in September 2006. The community braced itself for weeks of horrifying testimony. Families of the victims prepared to face the men who had destroyed their lives, and the nation watched, waiting to see whether justice would be served for the Tucker and Harvey families. September 2006. The Richmond courthouse was surrounded by media trucks, protesters, and family members of both the victims and the accused. Security was unprecedented. Emotions ran at fever pitch. Ricky Gray, now 29 years old, sat at the defense table in a suit and tie. He had gained weight during his 8 months in custody. His expression was flat, almost bored. Watching him, you would never guess that he was on trial for his life. The prosecution's opening statement was a masterpiece of controlled outrage. Robert Trono stood before the jury and methodically laid out what Ricky Gray had done. He described each victim. He showed photographs of them alive, smiling, celebrating, living their lives. Then he showed photographs of the crime scenes. Several jurors wept. One asked to be excused to collect himself. "This is not a case about doubt," Trono told the jury. "This is not a case where you will wonder whether the defendant committed these crimes. The evidence will prove beyond any possible doubt that Ricky Javen Gray tortured and murdered 7 members of the Tucker family, including 3 children. The evidence will prove that he did this for $400. The evidence will prove that he felt nothing. No remorse, no hesitation, no mercy." The defense's opening was more subdued. Ricky Gray's attorney acknowledged the horror of the crimes, but asked the jury to consider the larger context. "You will hear about a childhood of unspeakable abuse. You will hear about mental illness that went untreated for decades. You will hear about a system that failed Ricky Gray at every turn. This does not excuse what happened, but it explains it. And in explaining it, we ask you to consider whether death is the appropriate punishment, or whether life in prison would better serve justice." The trial proceeded through weeks of testimony. Forensic experts detailed the physical evidence. Medical examiners described the injuries suffered by each victim. Investigators walked through the crime scenes, explaining how they had reconstructed the sequence of events. The most devastating testimony came from family members of the victims. Relatives of the Tucker family took the stand, one by one, describing the people they had lost. "My brother Percy worked every day of his life," one witness testified. "He never asked for anything from anyone. He just wanted to take care of his family. And that man," she pointed at Ricky Gray, "that man took everything from us. He took my brother. He took my sister-in-law. He took my nephew. He took those children. For what? For $400? Ricky Gray showed no reaction. He stared straight ahead, occasionally whispering to his attorney, as if the testimony were happening in some other courtroom to some other defendant. This apparent indifference would prove significant. Jurors later reported that Gray's demeanor influenced their deliberations. His lack of remorse, his seeming boredom, his refusal to acknowledge the humanity of his victims, all of it contributed to their ultimate decision. The defense presented its case over 3 days. Psychological experts testified about Gray's traumatic childhood, his untreated disorders, his apparent inability to form normal emotional connections. They used terms like antisocial personality disorder and reactive attachment disorder and conduct disorder. Under cross-examination, however, these experts were forced to admit crucial points. They acknowledged that Gray understood the difference between right and wrong. They acknowledged that he was legally sane at the time of the crimes. They acknowledged that he had planned the attacks in advance, demonstrating the capacity for deliberate choice. The mental illness defense, while potentially mitigating, could not overcome the fundamental reality. Ricky Gray knew what he was doing. He knew it was wrong, and he did it anyway. In his closing argument, Trono brought everything back to the victims. "You've heard a lot about the defendant's childhood," he said. "You've heard experts use words that most of us can't even pronounce. But I want you to remember something. The Tucker family had no experts. The Tucker family had no lawyers. The Tucker family had no one to speak for them when Ricky Gray came through their door. They only had each other, and he killed them all. 4 children died in these crimes. 4 children who never had a childhood at all, traumatic or otherwise. 4 children who will never grow up, never fall in love, never have families of their own. Ricky Gray ended their lives before they began, and he did it without hesitation, without mercy, without a moment of doubt. The defense asks you to consider the defendant's past. I ask you to consider the victims' futures, the futures they will never have, the grandchildren Percy L. Tucker will never know, the songs the Harvey children will never sing, the lives that were stolen, not in a moment of passion, not in a fit of rage, but deliberately, methodically, cruelly. Justice demands accountability. Justice demands that this jury look at what Ricky Gray did and say clearly and without ambiguity that it was wrong, that it deserves the ultimate punishment, that the lives of these 11 people, these innocent, defenseless people, mattered enough that their killer should face the ultimate consequence. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours on the guilt phase. They returned unanimous verdicts of guilty on all counts. The penalty phase followed immediately. The same jury would now decide whether Ricky Gray should live or die. The penalty phase of a capital murder trial is unlike any other legal proceeding. The question is no longer whether the defendant committed the crime that has already been established. The question is whether the defendant deserves to live. This is an awesome responsibility. Jurors are asked to make a decision that carries the weight of life and death. They must weigh the aggravating factors, the severity of the crime, the vulnerability of the victims, the cruelty of the method, against any mitigating factors the defense can present. For Ricky Gray, the aggravating factors were numerous and overwhelming. Multiple victims, children among the dead, torture preceding the killings, complete absence of remorse, prior criminal history demonstrating a pattern of violence. The mitigating factors, while present, seemed almost trivial by comparison. Childhood abuse, mental illness, poverty. These were real factors in Ricky Gray's development, but they could not balance the scale against 11 murdered innocents. The defense made one final plea for mercy. They asked the jury to consider that executing Ricky Gray wouldn't bring back the victims, that life in prison without any possibility of release would protect society just as effectively as death, that choosing life over death would demonstrate the moral superiority of a justice system that values all human life, even the lives of the guilty. The prosecution responded with simple arithmetic: 11 people dead, 4 of them children, $400 stolen. At what point, Trono asked, does a crime become so terrible that death is the only appropriate response? If not for this crime, then for what? The jury retired to deliberate. They were out for 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and announced their recommendation: death. Ricky Gray showed no visible reaction. He was escorted from the courtroom to begin what would become a 12-year stay on death row. Ray Dandridge tried separately, was also convicted of capital murder. His penalty phase resulted in a life sentence without parole. The jury apparently gave some weight to his youth and his arguably subordinate role in the crimes. The verdicts brought a measure of closure to the families of the victims. But closure in a case like this is a relative term. The Tucker family would never be whole again. Percy L. Tucker Sr.'s legacy, 4 decades of work, a house built with his own hands, a family raised with love and discipline, had been destroyed in a single night. For the Harvey family, the situation was equally devastating. Brian and Catherine Harvey had been beloved members of their community. Their daughters had been full of life and potential. All of it gone. In the aftermath of the trial, survivors from both families spoke publicly about their losses. Their words were raw with grief, but also touched with something unexpected: determination. "Ricky Gray wanted to destroy us," one Tucker family member said. "He wanted to wipe out our family like we never existed, but he failed. We're still here, we're still standing, and we're going to keep Percy's memory alive no matter what." This defiance in the face of tragedy became a recurring theme. The killer had taken lives, but he hadn't broken spirits. The families refused to let Ricky Gray's cruelty define them. They established scholarship funds in the victims' names. They spoke at schools and community centers about violence prevention. They channeled their grief into action, determined to find some meaning in meaningless tragedy. But the legal story was not yet over. Ricky Gray had been sentenced to death, but the appeals process in capital cases can take years, sometimes decades. Gray would spend the next 12 years on death row, filing appeal after appeal, exhausting every possible legal avenue. During those years, the families waited. They attended hearings. They submitted impact statements. They lived with the uncertainty of whether Gray would ever actually face the punishment he had been given. And Ricky Gray, from his cell, continued to show nothing resembling remorse. In interviews, he spoke about his crimes with clinical detachment. He never apologized to the families. He never acknowledged the full weight of what he had done. Some observers saw this as evidence of mental illness, an inability to connect emotionally with his actions. Others saw it as confirmation of what they had always believed, that Ricky Gray was simply evil, that there was nothing inside him capable of remorse or redemption. Either way, the families waited, and eventually, after 12 years of legal maneuvering, their wait came to an end. The Sussex Winnie State Prison, located in Waverly, Virginia, houses Virginia's death row inmates. It's a maximum security facility designed to hold the state's most dangerous criminals in conditions of near total isolation. Ricky Gray arrived there in 2006. He would remain for the next 12 years. Life on death row is characterized by monotony. Inmates are confined to their cells for 23 hours per day. They have limited contact with other prisoners. Their world shrinks to the dimensions of a small concrete room. For some inmates, this isolation leads to reflection, to remorse, to genuine transformation. And there are documented cases of death row prisoners who have experienced profound spiritual or psychological awakenings during their years of confinement. Ricky Gray was not one of these cases. In the rare interviews he granted, Gray spoke about his crimes without apparent emotion. He didn't deny what he had done. The evidence was too overwhelming for that. But he also didn't seem to grasp the full horror of it. It wasn't personal, he said in one interview. "It was business. They had something I needed. That's all." This characterization, murder as business, revealed something important about Gray's psychology. He had reduced human beings to obstacles, to means to an end, to objects standing between him and what he wanted. This is the hallmark of psychopathy, the inability to see others as fully human. To Ricky Gray, Percy L. Tucker Sr. wasn't a man who had worked for 40 years to build a life. He was just a locked box containing money. The children weren't innocent lives full of potential. They were witnesses who needed to be silenced. This fundamental disconnect made rehabilitation impossible. You cannot teach empathy to someone who is constitutionally incapable of feeling it. You cannot awaken remorse in someone whose emotional architecture lacks the necessary components. During his years on death row, Gray filed numerous appeals. His attorneys raised every possible argument: ineffective assistance of counsel, juror misconduct, problems with the jury instructions, constitutional challenges to Virginia's death penalty procedures. Each appeal was rejected. The evidence of guilt was too clear. The trial had been conducted fairly. The jury had followed its instructions. There were no grounds for overturning the sentence. In 2017, Ricky Gray ran out of options. His final appeal was denied. The governor declined to grant clemency. An execution date was set, January 18, 2017. The families of the victims were notified. After 12 years of waiting, the end was finally in sight. But those 12 years had taken their toll. Some family members had died during the interval, never seeing justice fully served. Others had moved away, unable to remain in the city where their loved ones had been murdered. Still others remained in Richmond, holding on to their memories, waiting for the closure that only Gray's execution could bring. The days leading up to January 18th were tense. Gray's attorneys filed last-minute motions. Opponents of the death penalty organized protests outside the prison. Media from around the world descended on Virginia to cover the execution. Through it all, the families maintained their composure. They had waited 12 years for this moment. They were not going to be cheated now. And they weren't. On January 18, 2017, at 9:42 p.m., Ricky Javon Gray was pronounced dead by lethal injection at the Sussex State Prison. He was 39 years old. His last words were brief: "God bless this nation, God bless." Whether these words represented a genuine spiritual awakening or simply a final performance, no one can say. Ricky Gray went to his death without ever apologizing to the families he had destroyed, without ever acknowledging the full weight of what he had done. For the families, there were mixed emotions. Relief that it was finally over. Grief renewed by the reminder of all they had lost. Anger that Gray had never shown genuine remorse. And beneath it all, a profound sadness that no punishment, however severe, could bring back the people they loved. Ray Dandridge, Gray's accomplice, remained in prison serving his life sentence. He would never be released. He would grow old and eventually die behind bars. Whether he experienced the remorse that Ricky Gray seemed incapable of, only he could say. The Tucker family murders were officially closed. 11 years after that terrible night, justice had been served. But the story doesn't end there. In the years since Ricky Gray's execution, the surviving members of the Tucker family have worked to ensure that their loved ones are remembered not as victims, but as people who lived meaningful lives. Percy L. Tucker Sr. is remembered as a man who embodied the American dream. He started with nothing and, through decades of honest work, built a home and raised a family. His legacy is not the manner of his death, but the manner of his life. Dignified, determined, devoted. Mary Tucker is remembered as a woman of deep faith. Despite her health challenges, she maintained her belief in goodness, in God, in the fundamental decency of human beings. Her spirit lives on in the church she attended, where her memory is honored every Sunday. Percy L. Tucker Jr. is remembered as a son who never stopped trying. He had his struggles, but he was working towards something better. He deserved more time than he was given. Ruby Holt is remembered as a mother who did everything in her power to give her children a better life. She brought them into the Tucker home believing it would be safe. She died protecting them as best she could, and the children, those innocent children who lost their lives before they could truly live, they are remembered with a special tenderness. Their names are spoken at family gatherings. Their photographs are kept on mantles and in albums. They will not be forgotten. The Tucker family has channeled their grief into advocacy. They speak publicly about domestic violence, about the warning signs of dangerous individuals, about the importance of community vigilance. They have become, in their own way, warriors against the very kind of evil that destroyed their loved ones. Yet this transformation from victims to advocates is perhaps the most remarkable part of this story. Ricky Gray intended to annihilate the Tucker family, to erase them, to leave nothing behind but fear and pain. He failed. The Tucker family still exists. They have grown, they have healed, as much as healing is possible in the aftermath of such trauma. They have found purpose in their pain. This is not a happy ending in the traditional sense. 11 people are still dead. 4 children still never grew up. The absence of those lives is still felt every day by those who loved them. But there is something powerful in the survival of the survivors, in their refusal to be defined by tragedy, in their determination to find light in the darkness. Percy Tucker Sr. used to say that you couldn't control what happened to you, but you could control how you responded. His family has taken that wisdom to heart. They have responded to unspeakable tragedy with grace, with dignity, with purpose. This is their victory. Not over Ricky Gray, his execution took care of that, but over despair, over hopelessness, over the temptation to let grief consume everything good. The Harvey family, too, has found ways to honor their loved ones. The Richmond community came together in the aftermath of the murders to support both families. Memorials were established, funds were created. The city that had witnessed such horror also witnessed remarkable compassion. And what of the broader lessons? What can we as a society learn from the Tucker family murders and the Harvey family murders? First, we must recognize that evil exists. It's uncomfortable to acknowledge, but some people are capable of terrible things. Not because they were born evil, but because a combination of factors, genetics, environment, choices, led them down a path that ended in destruction. Second, we must invest in prevention. Ricky Gray showed warning signs throughout his childhood. He tortured animals, he committed violent crimes, he was in and out of institutions that should have helped him but didn't. At multiple points, intervention might have changed his trajectory. It's impossible to say for certain, but it's worth considering. Third, we must support survivors. The families who are left behind after violent crimes need our help. They need counseling, they need community, they need time and space to grieve. Too often we forget about them once the headlines fade. Fourth, and finally, we must never stop telling these stories. Not for entertainment, not for shock value, but because remembering is a form of resistance. By saying the names of Percy L. Tucker Sr. and Mary Tucker and all the others, we are refusing to let them be forgotten. We are honoring their lives by bearing witness to their deaths. That's why I've told you this story. That's why I've asked you to stay with me through 10 chapters of horror and heartbreak. Because the Tucker family deserves witnesses. They deserve people who will carry their memory forward. Let me take you back to where we started, a house on Belsius Lane, a family going about their ordinary lives, a monster with a key. We've traveled a long way since then, through the crime scenes, through the investigation, through the trial, through 12 years on death row, through the execution that finally brought a measure of justice. And now at the end of this journey, I want to leave you with something other than darkness. The Tucker family story does not end with murder. It does not end with execution. It continues right now in the hearts and minds of everyone who knew them, everyone who loved them, everyone who has heard their story and been moved by it. Percy L. Tucker Sr. spent his life building something. Not just a house, not just a career, but a legacy. A family that would carry his values forward. A community that was better because he was part of it. Ricky Gray tried to destroy that legacy. For $400 and a few hours of sadistic pleasure, he tried to wipe the Tucker family from existence. He failed. The Tucker name lives on. The Tucker spirit lives on. The Tucker legacy lives on. This is the truth that emerges from the darkness of this story. Evil doesn't have the last word. Death does not have the last word. Even in the face of unspeakable tragedy, love endures. Memory endures. Hope endures. Percy L. Tucker Sr. would want us to remember that. He would want us to remember that the measure of a life is not how it ends, but how it's lived. He lived with integrity, he lived with purpose, he lived with love. His killer lived with none of those things. And in the end, that's what matters. I want to thank you for staying with me through this story, for bearing witness to the Tucker family, for refusing to look away even when the details were difficult. If this story has moved you, I ask one thing: share it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Share it so that the Tucker family's memory reaches one more person, touches one more heart. And remember, every day we choose who we're going to be. We choose whether to build or destroy, whether to love or hate, whether to lift others up or tear them down. Percy L. Tucker Sr. made his choice every single day for 66 years. He chose to build. He chose to love. He chose to be a good man in a world that doesn't always reward goodness. Make that same choice today. Make it tomorrow. Make it every day for the rest of your life. That's the Tucker family legacy. That's what survives the horror and the headlines and the heartbreak. That's what evil can never destroy. For Percy L. Tucker Sr., for Mary Tucker, for Percy L. Tucker Jr., for Ruby Holt, for the children who never grew up, for everyone who lost someone to violence and refused to let grief win, for everyone who chooses every day to be a light in the darkness. This is their story. This is their victory. And now, it's part of yours. Stay safe. Stay vigilant. Stay compassionate. And never ever forget that the lives of the forgotten matter. Until next time.